We're on. Brian Maierhofer, thank you for coming on part 2. I appreciate you, man. How are you doing today?
I'm great, brother. I had an incredible morning, long walk, long meditation, lots of sunshine, and happy to be here, man. Feeling joyful.
I love it. I love it. I want to get into like your practices for staying aligned and like counterbalancing or counteracting these trends of depression, anxiety, all these things that you would recommend to people. But the first thing I was curious about, I texted you about this a little bit ago, was your bio says therapist and then it says acolyte. So for everybody out there who doesn't know what it means, and I've actually kind of forgotten, what is an acolyte and why is that in your bio?
Yeah, so an acolyte, I'm not really sure on like the etymology of the word or where it comes from, but it really means in service to the sacred. So what an acolyte is somebody who assists in a ceremonial procession, right? They're the people who put on the ceremony to help initiate and call in whatever energy that they're working with. It's really in service to the sacred is the way that I like to think of it.
Where did it come from? Like, why did you get the inspiration to put that there?
So there is another creator who has been like just a huge like North Star for mine. He has a podcast called The Emerald. His name is Josh. His last name is escaping me right now. But it's something that he refers to himself as. And so he lives in kind of like the depth psychology, mythical thinking type world, which is so much my background. And I'm just a massive fan. I mean, I listen to his every single podcast that comes out. You would probably love it. You should check him out.
Yeah, definitely remind me after to check it out. I'd love to. I'm starting to dip my toe into this stuff more and more, like going into archetypes, reading a little bit of Jung. I haven't dove deep. It's interesting because it seems like you've gone the psychology to more of the mysticism and spirituality, whereas and sometimes I've been thinking about this, I bypassed the psychology and went straight to the mystical. And so now it's actually, how can I integrate a healthy psyche with deep mystical spiritual experiences? So that was another topic I really wanted to touch on. So maybe we just go right into it. It's like, how do you strike the balance between deep spiritual understanding and awareness and mystical experiences with a worldly, practical, healthy psyche, operating ego in the world? Like, how do you think about that?
So the psychology or the information or the education, right? What that has been able to do for me is it's allowed me to create form out of the formlessness of a mystical experience, right? So the mystical experience in itself, right? It's formless, it's ethereal, it's ineffable, right? It's something invisible that you're experiencing in the visceral, right? But sort of coming out of that space, if you don't have a cultural context, which we don't really have here in the West, right? Like in the East with yoga or Buddhism, right? They have a cultural context that allows them to anchor these experiences to really create form and integration and understanding around what it is, right? And so we don't really have that here. And so part of my mission, part of my own vocation, I believe, is to help create a spiritual or a cultural context for more of these experiences, right? And so I have like the psychological understanding that creates container around that formless experience, helps me integrate it on the back end, right? And really, if we want to get more into some of the classic myth, right, it allows me to come back with the sacred elixir, right? So this is kind of the hero's journey thing, right? When the hero goes into his descent, he descends into the underworld, right? And so throughout that process, our ego is having greater disillusionment. We're going deeper into self and really into collective consciousness. And we go down to find the boon, is what Joseph Campbell calls it, or like the magic potion, the sacred elixir. And then from grabbing that jewel, we come back out of the descent and return to our community with the purpose to share that elixir, that boon, that gift with the community, right? And so the psychology and that background and the understanding of myth has really helped me understand why I have a mystical longing, why I like to go into a descent, why I like to experience the formlessness, right? But there's kind of two sides to it. And this kind of brings to mind something, you know, our sort of Western obsession with self. You know, I think a lot of people can go into these formless mystical experiences and they like how it tastes. They like how it feels, right? But it can teeter and it can get really close on this sense of like power or desire to possess and own that experience or some of those energies that are available, right? And so in really kind of losing my thought here, in really understanding that the goal of that experience, it isn't about self, right? So if yes, there's healing and we have, you know, there's person and personal aspects to it, but the orientation around it is that it's really for the collective. And so if I don't have that very clear motivation as to why I'm going into this space, whether it's through meditation or a psychedelic or a ceremony, whatever it is, and just for me personally, and just in my own personality disposition or whatever, in the past, I used to want to like equate myself to it, right? Or take ownership of it, like exploit it in some ways, right? It's going to be good for business. It's good for whatever, yada, yada. It feels powerful. It feels blissful, right? And it's actually not, and there's not any real freedom in that when you're trying to take ownership of it or have a transactional relationship for self in the mystical experience, right? So in understanding kind of the psychological background of individuation, you know, Jung's thing, then it helps me really orient my why. Why am I like taking the road less traveled? Like, yes, it's for me, but it's for a way bigger picture and a way bigger cause. And if I didn't have the psychology background, just for me personally, the temptation to like want to live in that space, want to own it, want to make it mine, really want to just inflate my own ego as a result of what I experience is too great, right? So I really have to have the container around it.
Fascinating. There's so many little rabbit holes I think we could go down here. I'm like, where do we even begin? I think I want to go deeper into the myth, the whole idea of a myth, and like, why are we so drawn to them? Why, as a kid, was I so obsessed with Harry Potter, and I still am? Like, I watched a video the other night with Jordan Peterson, Aubrey Marcus, talking about the symbol of the golden snitch in Harry Potter, and how Peterson was talking about just how incredible it is that billions of people read this book about this mythical orphan who had magical powers. Like, why are we so drawn to these experiences? And what does it say about both the individual and the collective? Why would somebody like me, why would somebody like you be so drawn to, say it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars? Like, what is it about these things that literally pulls us and grips us into the story?
Yeah, well, you know, first off, you know, Joseph Campbell would say that myth is our collective dream, and our individual dreams are our own sort of personal myth, right? So there's kind of like a polarity that exists within that, right? So, and I fully believe that. I fully believe that myth is a collective dream in a way. And I also 100% fully believe that these myths and these stories are alive, like alive in the truest sense, right? These energies, these complexes, these constellations of energy, they're autonomous, meaning they exist beyond our own ego. They exist in the astral, in the collective, right? And so, and looking at myth, and we can maybe just kind of circle in on like the hero's journey, right? Kind of this like broad general structure that seems to encompass a lot of these myths, right? These 12 stages and steps that go within it. I believe, you know, and Jung and Campbell and a lot of these folks would say that, you know, these story arcs and these stories, they represent the evolution of the soul, and they represent the evolution of, or the journey of psychological death and rebirth, right? So there's a natural sort of rhythm to the universe, right? There's a natural sort of like, you know, expansion, inflation. There's a natural pulse that exists within the universe and with energy, right? Like a wave. And so our own psychology follows in alignment with that trajectory, right? So we, you know, like we have to have psychological death in order to have the rebirth of the next insight or the next lily pad, whatever the next thing is, right? And so the myth is very much a representation of like death and birth, both in the literal, but also in the metaphysical and in the psychological as well.
Fascinating.
Right. So there's a reason why a lot of this symbolism, you know, shows up again and again and again, right? You look at like the Old Testament, like Moses receiving the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, right? What is a mountain representative of? It represents like a peak, a spiritual peak, a heightened state, right? And then there's all this symbolism around the cave too, right? I mean, Jesus was resurrected in a cave, right? I believe there's something with Elijah in a cave. The cave is that death, right? It is like that final, like ending resting point where the death comes, the alchemy occurs, and then there's a rebirth coming out of the cave. And then what happens, right? The figure leaves the cave and they return to their people. And so that's what I was talking about with the descent and going in and getting the boon. You go into the cave, into the belly of the whale, right? And then you come out of that and you're literally reborn.
Yeah, your ability to articulate this is incredible. And I think it speaks to how much you've read on the subject and going into the depths of psychology. But I don't think that you could explain it this well if you didn't experience it. Like there's a difference between just reading it theoretically or actually living it and now being able to speak about it. So like, are you having these experiences often? Are you seeing myths play out in your life? Like what does going into the cave and looking for the boon and bringing it back look like for you? Is that like a common practice? Does it happen like once a year? Like what does it look like for you?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a natural rhythm to it as well, right? And you look at astrology and there's this, what is it called? The Saturn's returns,
I was
right?
looking at that this morning, of course.
Yeah. And like, it's not an accident that people experience massive emotional, spiritual, psychological upheavals around that period of their life, right? What is it, like 28 to 35, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the symbolism too of Jesus's life within that as well, right around that. So myself personally, the last 4 years have actually been like a huge descent for me in general, right? And the way I think of like the descent, well, there's a couple different things. One of them, sorry, there's a loud van out there. Pull me back a little bit. Where were we at?
Yeah, we were talking about Saturn return, massive changes. What does it look like for you to go into the cave? Like, is that something that happens regularly? You were talking about how it's more naturally just happening in the flow of life, in the flow of the universe. And the last 4 years have been a descent.
Yes, big time. So I do believe that there are kind of like general times in life where the psyche naturally goes through this sort of process. You look at the Saturn returns, you kind of look at like midlife crises, right? Every like 30 years ago, it seems to happen. But for me personally, it's always the marrying of the psychological and the spiritual, right? And so my psychological approach as I'm sort of getting ready to shed an old skin and maybe go into the descent, whether it includes a psychedelic or not, or like a big trip into the wilderness or a meditation retreat or whatever, a lot of that preparation work is really diving really deep into my own thinking, my own beliefs, but specifically around opening myself up to the limitations of my own beliefs, right? If I can understand that my own thinking is limited and my beliefs based off of my limited experience also is limited, then there must be something beyond that. So the first phase of it, I think of it like chiseling away at like a sculpture or a statue, right? Just cutting off the little pieces that I know aren't mine, where did this sort of thought life come from? Where is this pattern from? Where is this belief from? Is it cultural? Is it family? Is it really mine? And then ultimately it's about completely letting that go, right? And whether it's in meditation practice or whatever it is, but it's really about dissolving any attachment to self, any attachment to my own ideas, any attachment to what I think's best for me or where I think the direction of my life is going to go. And then it's about finding ways to open myself up to, what Jung would call like the numinous, right? So the word numen means holy, comes from the 1913 book by Rudolf Otto. I only know that because I wrote a thesis on this. And so the container, the descent for me is 100% like relational, in that it's relational to something beyond myself. It's relational to other with a capital O, right? And so there's three kind of traditional stages that are present in initiation, present in ceremony, present in rites of passage. We might have talked about this a little bit on my first podcast, which is, so the first one is separation or severance. So that's what I was talking about, right? Like severing, chipping away at the things that I don't think are best for me as I move on to the next lily pad of life.
Mm-hmm.
That middle phase, which is called liminality, which is one of my favorite words. Liminal means betwixt and between. It's like a purgatory, the place in between. So in that liminal space, it's nothing but openness and willingness, right? And there's different kind of, I don't know, whether in ceremonies, different kind of tools and things that you can use to like help kind of create more openness and more willingness, right? And then coming out on the third end of that is just this process of incorporation or integration as well.
Mm.
Yeah. And this actually, it goes a little bit deeper too. And I'm not an expert on this, so like bear with me, but I believe if you look at the process of like cellular biology, right? There's even kind of 4 stages within that too, and how cells evolve that very much model this type of framework. So I find that really interesting.
I love how we can draw these parallels across disciplines. Like I've recently gotten so deep into astrology specifically. And I thought I knew psychology before just because I like took a few psychology classes in college and knew my Myers-Briggs was like INFJ. Then I start diving into the depths of astrology and I start dipping my toe in human design and gene keys and Ayurveda and even a little bit of Vedic astrology. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I knew next to nothing about psychology. And so I feel I understand people more now by their astrology signs, like not just their sun, but across their entire chart, than I ever did by saying, oh, he's like just an ENFP, right? Like we're so multidimensional. So, and something I heard, maybe you can verify if this is true. I heard that Carl Jung was an astrologist as well. Have you heard of this?
I'm not super informed on that, but I know it's in his right. I mean, specifically, he would frame it more through the lens of like cosmology, right?
Okay.
So when he's writing on traditional yogic sciences and he's writing about, like prana, like that breath of life, he frames it in like literally like in every breath of prana and life force, they're actually like inhaling the cosmos. Each breath contains the cosmos. And Jung was also big on this idea of like eons, right? Like we're kind of coming out of this like age of Pisces or the Piscean, is that what it's called? Piscean age, into like the age of Aquarius.
Yes.
Like he definitely went really deep into these ages, these astrological ages too.
I love that. I love that he went into that. I didn't even know. That might be worth me researching after, but I've been dipping my toe into this age of Aquarius we're entering, and it's actually shaping how I am building and positioning myself for the future in this entrepreneurship game. So this can be interesting to talk about. I've also been reading this book. It's incredible. I think you'd love it. It's called The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. And it's this book channeled from somebody directly from the Akashic records about the entire story about Jesus and his travels to the East and his travels to India and studying with Buddhist masters and yogic masters. And I believe what it talks about in the end of the book, and I haven't gotten there yet, but it's this transition. Jesus was laying the foundation. Buddha was laying the foundation for our planetary shift into the age of Aquarius and into this 5D new Earth. So
this new Earth.
This new Earth.
And if you look at, again, in the Old Testament, one of the early stories is about the bull, right? They're praying to a false idol, a bull that they have on this hill that they're praying to, and it's like the smashing the death of that bull. And so what is that symbolizing? It's symbolizing the end of the age of like Taurus, and then moving into the Piscean age, right? The bull as Taurus. Yeah.
And from what I've heard, the age of Aquarius is the age of spirit. It's the age of spirituality. It's the age of decentralization, getting away from power structures. So how I'm thinking about it, and maybe then we could segue into like what you're thinking about building and creating and your vision for your life, because I know they're pretty big. My philosophy right now is with 2 main projects. And I guess the third is just overall sharing content and education through podcasts, through books, through written form. But my 2 main projects, Transcendence, which is like this decentralized technology to facilitate quantum healing at scale through the internet. That to me is positioned for the age of Aquarius. Now time will tell, but my friend Tej Dosa has a great quote. He's a great writer, copywriter, marketer. He's like, position yourself 3 to 5 years ahead of where the world is heading and wait for time to catch up. I love that quote. And so for me, it's like that's forming the foundation of how I'm thinking about long-term business, as well as conscious creators, right? Like people like you, people like me, especially more so people like you who have had the depth into a specific discipline, like let's say it's astrology or it's psychology or it's human design, or it's like a synthesis of all of these different branches. How can then you package it into your own brand and distribute it to the world to raise consciousness? So for me, like my entire philosophy and ethos is, and I'm having deja vu right now, it's interesting, is how can I position myself for this consciousness revolution, this 5D new Earth, this age of Aquarius? It's all tied in. So tell me about how you're thinking about this future, because I know you're tapped into all the same things I am. And so how is it shaping your business decisions, life decisions, projects, both in this moment and like how you're thinking about it over the next decade plus?
Yeah, man, there's so many different pieces there. I mean, I think the one thing that is really clear of what we're seeing is that we are sort of collectively seeing a massive renaissance in our relationship to power, right? Whether you see that in Hollywood with Diddy and Weinstein, or Epstein and politics, what's going on right now, et cetera. Like collectively, there's this whole big thing going on around like power, what that means, how to use power appropriately, right? Recognizing that it's neither bad nor good, right? And really about what's coming to mind for me right now, which is I love so much, which is Plato's philosophy when he talks about leadership in general, right? And so Plato's ideal, utopian government or whatever it is, he believed that the world should be run by a bunch of philosopher kings.
Yeah.
Very specifically, right? And it's because justice, so Plato wrote a lot about love and justice, right? He had this picture of like a 2-winged chariot. He kind of said that like all that exists in the world is this 2-winged chariot. On one wing is love, the other wing is justice. And that's all that it is, right? But in order to have a proportionate relationship to power, you have to have a visceral relationship to justice as a true philosopher, right? And only somebody who, I mean, this is like Graham Hancock. He's like, I don't think any politician should run unless they've drinking ayahuasca 10 times, right?
Dude, I heard that quote right before my first ayahuasca, and I was like, wow, this is true.
Yeah, right. And so it actually ties a little bit back into what we were talking about with this symbol of death, right? And so there's this Greek saying, they say, if you die before you die, then you never die. And Jung has a quote on this too, right? He says, the first man is from Earth, the second man is from the stars, right? And so those aren't two different people. What it is the psychological and spiritual death that exists in between the two of those, right? And so some of these ancient rites that, you know, people like Marcus Aurelius, Plato, right, Cicero, were all having this experience where they would go into this ceremonial rite, and, you know, very often they would use some type of entheogen, a psychedelic compound, right? Would have ergot, which is where the compound of LSD is extracted from. So they would drink this ergot potion to go die before they died, so that they never died, right? So what they would do, and the myth and how they would orient themselves around it, is they would go in this experience down into the underworld to go meet Hades, right? The devil, like that, you know, dark prince, the dark masculine. But the goal wasn't to go get a glimpse of Hades. The goal was to go get a glimpse of Hades's wife. And who was Hades' wife? Hades' wife was Persephone. And so Persephone is the purest of all feminine, right? That eros, that true innocent moisture of the feminine, right? And what beautiful imagery that they paint in this polarity. Of course, the most pure feminine would be connected to the darkest of the masculine, right? So, and this
can make me cry. Like thinking back to my ayahuasca journeys, like that's exactly what happened. I went to the depths of my own psyche that I didn't even know were there. And what I found, the only answer I could find of like, why, what's the point of any of this, was love and beauty. The purest expression of the feminine, a girl singing, a flower blooming. Like, wow, you're giving me chills talking about this.
And it's a visceral experience though. So this is how you know justice. This is how you begin to know these things, but I don't mean know with a K, I mean know with a G. Do you know what I mean by that?
No, but I'm assuming it's connected to something with like Gnosticism.
Yeah, exactly. So gnosis just means to know, but it means to know viscerally, to really know, to have experienced, not just to be able to quote it from a book. And so again, this is why Plato would say, you know, people who are in power, they have to know with a G. And only when you know with a G, then you in a proper position to really face power in a truly, you know, philosophical and mature way.
Man, this goes deep. I haven't really had this type of conversation with anybody. So I had the insight during ayahuasca that, well, the whole thing was really tough. I mean, my first experience at 22, so like over a year and a half ago, it was pretty mild. It was pretty expansive. It was like, oh my gosh, I can do anything. I can be like the people I look up to. The second one, I went deep down and saw through the cracks of the ego. And then the 5 ceremonies that happened in October, like they were challenging. They were to the depths. But at the same time, there was a knowingness within me that I'm going to return here. I even had the thought, like, maybe I would just do it secretly once a month just to make sure that I'm living in integrity with my highest self. Now that hasn't panned out. I'm not going to do that, I don't think. But maybe sometime in the future. But I do have a knowingness that I'm going to return. I got this imagery in my mind of like 23 and 24 repeating a lot. They're very important years for me. So 23 is now. Now I had the 5 ceremonies. I'm living it out. I'm integrating into my life. I'm back in college. I'm going to graduate. I'm playing quarterback, building businesses. But at 24, I think another big shift is going to happen. Like now that I'm past college into true adulthood sovereignty. But I'm curious for you, like with this understanding. And I remember the last podcast, and you've told me that like psychedelics aren't something you want to go into anymore. Like, has that evolved? What's your current state on that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm super open to it. You know, I'm somebody who has a history of addiction. I spent a lot of time and, you know, completely abstinent, sober in 12-step programs. There is a sort of a shift that's happening within the field of recovery that I believe. And I do believe that these compounds, A, they're not for everyone. B, they are incredible. They are super, super helpful in illuminating for this specific thing. But it does bring to mind sort of the Alan Watts quote when he's like, hey, you know, when you hear God's voice on the phone, it's time to hang up, you know? So for me, it's really like, it's openness. There are certain compounds that I know that I do better with than the other ones. There's certain compounds that I have a way deeper relationship to, but it's definitely just for myself, it's a bit of a slippery slope. So I'm super mindful of it. But what I will say, and it's kind of how we started out, is I see myself as somebody who's helping usher in a real cultural context for this type of work, right? Like I do believe that we should have like psychedelic, like chaplains, acolytes, right? This is the word acolyte, right? I'm not saying that's my role or whatever, but I do think that that is necessary. There are certain people, certain seekers, certain personalities and dispositions that are more cut out for this work and that are willing to just like turn over more stones than the other folks, right? These are kind of our class, you know, Jung would say, you know, the shaman swims where the schizophrenic drowns, right? And so yeah, yeah, right. And so we need this, right? And I think that folks who like myself, who naturally have a big calling to this type of work, I mean, like the way I kind of look at it, and this is really base and take of it what you will, is like, I'm actually like a devotional being, like to death, like death and life. Like, it's really like, I've learned that like death and our sort of like extinction, our fear of extinction, the extinction instinct or whatever it's called in evolutionary psychology, it runs our psyche in so many different ways, right? And so there are folks, I believe, that are better equipped to go down and face Hades, right? And witness Persephone and come back up with the boon. And so that's what you described too in your ayahuasca experiences. I mean, that's the myth, that's the descent, that's into the cave, right? That's you finding the magic elixir and then you now coming back out and integrating it in your life, in your business, in your social life or whatever. Like, you're living the myth, right? So I would say to you also that like these myths are chasing you, right? These stories, these archetypal energies, these constellations, they are relational, like literally in the truest sense, they are alive. And so the more we can create space for that relationship, the more we can receive. Because relationship isn't just about giving. The hardest part is actually receiving, right? So this is so abstract, but a lot of the things that I think about is like, how can I receive more from the symbol of death? Not in like I chose this body. I'm here for a reason. I plan on being here for a long time. But even when I was in my active addiction, it wasn't really just because I was trying to set my life on fire or trying to avoid my emotions or yada, yada. No, it's actually addiction at its base is a devotional thing. It's very devotional. And I had to get really clear on what it was that I was chasing and what it was that I was devoted to, right? And it was really this dual symbol of death and life, of the numinous, right? And so this thing, this energy, these constellations have really been pulling me my entire life. And so for so many times I resisted it. I didn't know what it was. It's confusing. Intellectually, you can't understand it. So there's some challenges. There's some back and forth with it. And where I feel like I'm at now is that I'm not resisting it. I don't know what it means. You know, I do know that one of my gifts is to go experience like real complexity, real novelty in consciousness, and then come back and be able to communicate it to you and to other folks in a manner that hopefully is pretty accessible. Right. I'm still learning how to do that, to create, you know, more accessibility in my language and to allow people to really understand my experiences and what I'm talking about. But that's what I'm here to do. Right. Like, I think that consciousness itself is like a magnet for the intersection of novelty and complexity. And so Terence McKenna talked about this a lot. Right. And so we have two different hemispheres in our brain, two different sort of orientations, right? System 1, system 2. Jung would call it personality 1, personality 2. There's this bilateral thing, this dance that goes on within our brain. Losing my thought here. Pull me back.
consciousness is the intersection of complexity
novelty
and novelty. That's a great quote too.
Exactly, right? And so the left brain, which just wants to categorize, is a complexity like machine. It's designed to create form out of complexity. That's really what it seeks, right? The more it can understand, the more it can hold, the more complexity it can contain. And now the other aspects of the brain, like the right brain, that's more formless, creative, just wants novelty, freedom, play, to like turn over the stone that hasn't been unturned, go enter the forest at the darkest place. It wants novelty of experience. And so where those two things meet, complexity and novelty, to me, that's what consciousness is doing, right? It's constantly folding on top of itself in the collective, ever traversing towards greater novelty and greater complexity, right? And so when you go and you have these experiences, that's what you taste. You go and you taste novelty, and then in the integration, you're creating form around the complexity of it, right? That's what the integration is. So then you get both. And that's really where like the true fruit sits.
Wow. I mean, I haven't reflected this much on my journey in a long time. This conversation feels pretty divinely orchestrated. But something I want to go into is like, you seem to have a very clear sense of like, this is why I'm here. And that is a really beautiful thing to have. But it also comes for me sometimes with like this perceived burden of like, fuck, like that seems like a big load. So how do you deal with that? And like, maybe could you get even more specific on like, this is why I'm here? I think you were talking about like an acolyte, or to be somebody who can help bring a container around this complexity. But does it ever feel to you like a burden?
Not anymore. Not anymore. But it caused me a lot of suffering and a lot of pain for a long time because I didn't feel normal. I felt different, right? And especially coming from like an upper middle class, like white suburbia, you know, none of this like messaging or modeling was available to me, right? My family is super secular, like the crews I was running around with, super secular. Outside of music, that was kind of my only taste of like real sort of like mysticism. But ultimately, and this is a symbol that like has shown up in my dreams, that has really been following me for a long time, is the symbol of a bridge, right? As a bridge builder, which brings to mind for me the trickster archetype, and we could get into that a little bit. But I am the type of person who has, you know, 1 foot in the mystical and 1 foot in the pragmatic, right? 1 foot in spirituality and 1 foot in psychology, right? And so as somebody who may, I'm not going to totally equate this, may be able to swim in some waters where other people may drown, or really just where other people aren't willing to go, right? It actually feels like a great privilege and an honor that I get to then serve as a bridge, just as, you know, maybe a little bit farther down the river than some folks. It can just be like, hey, there's actually a waterfall there to the left. So if you go to the right, you know, I've been there. Like I know exactly. And when I've done work, when I've facilitated ceremonies for friends and people like that, you know, like, so first of all, when I do work with people, like I don't ever ingest the amount of the compound that the person who's going through the ceremony is, but just a little taste to sort of get in the flow, get in the psychology of it. And I can very much sort of feel and understand and like intuit where they're kind of at and where kind of those curves and those roadblocks are. And simply having been there before, there's just a great safety in that, right? I don't do anything mad. It's not me, right? I'm not doing anything particular, but there's just a great safety in like knowing, right? And simply being there with somebody in space who's having an experience and just knowing just like what that experience is, and just like a little smile on it, because I'm like, yeah, it sucks. Yeah, I know it's painful. Yeah, it's scary. I know, breath, you know, and just like really being there. So like, it's just about bridge building, man. It's just about bridge building. As we move into this kind of new earth direction where old paradigms are coming down, I also part of my responsibility or my goals or one of my ideals is that I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And I think some folks that are kind of way too far on one end of the spectrum, they're missing the mark too, right? And so my goal is that I can be somebody who can help detangle the threads around this paradigm shift and bring some clarity to an area that holds a lot of noise and a lot of ego and a lot of spiritual bypassing and a lot of, as I said, again, absence of true cultural context that allows people to really find meaning, substantial meaning in these experiences.
Yeah, I'd love to dive in there. So maybe we could start talking with your perspective on like what is the new paradigm, what's the new earth, what does that mean, and what aspects are the ultra spiritual idealists looking over or bypassing or trying to throw out from the current way that you think are actually important things to maintain even as we make a transition?
Yeah, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this. So these are kind of just going to be my raw thoughts, and they're not going to be well thought out. I don't even really know if I have too much to say. So, well, first of all, I've actually never even read that Eckhart Tolle book, The New Earth, but I feel like I have a general sort of idea, and I really have a pulse on my finger on like the spiritual community and kind of the mental health community as well. I kind of have pulses on both, but again, as I kind of touched on a little bit, I think it is very much about the relationship between power and innocence. Again, like these two symbols are so potent, and there's a reason why in so many stories or movies like True Grit or whatever, there's like an old man and a young girl, because it's about that polarity. Anyways, I don't want to get too into that. There's very clearly a decentralization that's happening, right? And you know, Yogananda said, who I'm just kind of new on and learning through my girlfriend, you know, talking about, you know, mind-body medicine being the medicine of the future, right? And so there is a lot of decentralization that we're seeing right now, whether it's with money, whether it's with, you know, medicine and healing. We've talked about quantum healing a little bit, but I don't believe complete decentralization is the answer, right? In order to create container for the formless, you actually have to have some centralized power or some centralization in a capacity. And I know how I would do this for myself, like a part of my big future. Like I know what this kind of looks like for me. But in also understanding the compensatory nature of the psyche. So the Nike, it compensates, right? So we understand a truth. We viscerally experience a truth. The temptation is to just throw it all out, completely sever from it. This was all wrong. I was all wrong. I was all off base. I bet my whole life has been a lie, yada, 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 and compensate and live all the way over here. And for me, that's not the answer either, right? It's about this space in between. And it's about, if we have two options, the third option is what exists within the tension between the two. And so it's about finding the third, what exists in the middle, right? What is the balance there? I think that's all I kind of have on that. I don't know if I got off topic a little bit. Yeah. New Earth. I don't know. It's very much about power. It's very much about greater consciousness, greater understanding and interconnectedness. And we're beginning to see this too with like the telepathy tapes. I don't know if you listen to that podcast. Like telepathy is real, right? And like you get into an ayahuasca ceremony or whatever, like I've had those experiences. Like it's very real, you know? And what we're seeing right now too with like non-human intelligence, NHIs, these orbs, some of these meditative protocols, Stephen Greer's work, you know, C5 meditations, and looking at physics, right? The non-locality of the universe, the non-locality of consciousness, right? In physics, you know, a particle can exist in two different places simultaneously. It's non-local, just as our consciousness is. And so I don't think it's an accident, or it's just a trend that we're seeing more people who are spiritually inclined, right? More souls that chose to come here and find bodies at this time right now in an effort to help shepherd in the new. I think part of my resentment and bitterness in the past was like, man, spiritual people, all this language, da 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 da. It's just because it's in vogue. It's just trendy. It's just social media. Like it's just in vogue. There's not actually an intelligence working within it. And I don't believe that anymore. I don't believe that anymore.
What shifted around that?
Just 100% personal experience, 100% coming to accepting my own vocation, my own spiritual vocation, my mid to like late 20s. I was talking about this with my therapist yesterday. I was bitter. I was resentful because I'd lived what I believe to be like a morally righteous life. I use that word intentionally, right? Like I did the right things. I said the prayers, I read the books, I tried to be of service. I'm getting out of self. It's not about me. Let me be a therapist. Let me be of service, yada, yada, yada. But then I'm still in pain. I'm still suffering. This doesn't amount to anything, right? And so I think I got resentful and bitter about like the whole conversation and was kind of just like, oh, it's all nonsense. It's all garbage, right? And so what shifted was was the pain, right? Was the willingness to embrace the pain without trying to understand the why of it, and just approaching the what, which is for me, that's like somatics big time. Not managing, but facing the what, as in my suffering or the pain, and processing it in some capacity. Then the why just doesn't really matter as much. So I had a story around it that I found was just a story that I was telling myself to keep myself from going deeper into the pain, and not in a way that involves psychedelics or anything, but in a way where like I'm literally on my knees, like sobbing, like real grief, like messy pain, right? A soul cry, a soul release through grief. And this is why when like I see the was it the Hawkins map of consciousness, and he's got grief down there. So I love it, but that's like my one little sticking point, and he's way fucking smarter than I am, whatever. But I believe that grief is one of the most potent and powerful experiences that we can, or emotions that we can have on this planet. But it's not just grief around the loss of a loved one. It's grief around the loss of the old self, grief around that psychological death, right? And needing to fully grieve until so that I can have the psychological rebirth, right? So the tears, that grief, it literally waters the soil for the new seeds. And if I don't let myself go there, just me personally, because I'm a dude or too masculine, or it's ugly, or I don't want to cry in front of my girlfriend because she's going to lose attraction or whatever, it's all horseshit. It's all horseshit, right? And so like leaving those old ideas behind and then folding in like the somatics with some of this work, it really, in a couple years, like it feels like it happened really fast. Although when I talk about it now, it's been like 3 or 4 year journey, but it's this process of remembering ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, I see even within myself right now, like we could call it boyhood and manhood. Like I see the dichotomy playing out in my life. I see the aspects of my own psyche that are still trying to cling on from boyhood, and then the aspects of my higher self that are trying to pull me forward. And there's this tension. And so you talk about alchemy, you talk about grief, you talk about like letting that old version die. And so like if I look at myself and I see these subtle behaviors that play out that are more in boyhood, that are not aligned with the highest self, for myself and for everybody listening, how do you actually go through that process of grief, of alchemy, of transformation? What does it look like, or what did it look like for you?
The first thing is that for me, this game is very much a process of subtraction rather than addition. And so what I mean by subtraction is just less stimulus, less noise, less people, less meetings, less calls, less whatever, to just create more space, right? I think the quickest route to like a true spiritual life or spiritual relationship is through the process of subtraction, as opposed to adding all these things in, new programs, new coaches, new mentors, new meditation, new psychedelic, yada, 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 right? It's sort of getting off that hamster wheel a little bit and creating ultimate space. The other thing is that for me, it's all about identity flexibility. And so I use that very intentionally because, you know, Eastern Buddhism, whatever, it's like, no, you are no self, remove self. This is not Brian here having this conversation. Great. I love it. We have no cultural context for that. Our Western mind does not have the context to really understand that, right? And so the language I prefer is identity flexibility, right? So the literature around, you know, cognition is very clear that flexibility in your thinking is the key to happiness, right? That's like very, very clear in the literature. And I take it a step further. Identity flexibility is the key to happiness, right? And so if I saw myself too much as an actor or as an athlete or even a brother or a boyfriend or whatever, like it's just, I have no attachment really to the labels anymore. Instead, what I have attachment to are virtues.
And what are some of those virtues for you?
Like courage, right? Willingness, perseverance, these things that are static, right? So our beliefs or our identity, they're dynamic. They change all the time. So if that is really like my main anchor, my identity of who I am, it's too dynamic for me. It's not the fuel just it's not nutritious enough for me, right? But if I identify myself as somebody who lives a life of integrity, who is striving for nobility and grace, those are static, right? And there's a reason why these virtues have, you know, existed all throughout time in all the stories, etc., because there are these real constellations and anchor points that are timeless.
I love that. I love defining yourself more so by the virtues rather than what you're doing. And even introspecting on myself a little bit, I trend towards negative behaviors, addictions, bad habits when I become too attached to one identity of myself. So I do a lot of different things, right? I'm a podcaster, writer, entrepreneur, quarterback, psychology student, etc. And when it's in flux and my principle is like freedom and love and humility, that's great. But when I become too attached and it comes from a needingness or a fear or a scarcity, I'm assuming I'm an entrepreneur and there's too much emphasis there, that's when the imbalance leads to an imbalance of the addiction coming up, of the overindulgence coming up, whatever it is. So that's a gem right there, right? And I've been on this idea for so long of like, keep your identity small. It's an article by Paul Graham. It's so good. And I love this: identify by the virtues you live up to, not by the label of who you are in society. That's a gem. That's a real gem.
In on a more like practical level, what helps me really, really stay anchored into this philosophy is that I design my life so that I'm very much so simultaneously both a son and a father. And what I mean by that is that I'm in the chain link of mentorship and like discipleship, not in like that base way, but right. But folks that I have that come to me for support and guidance. I get to be I'm such a religious allegorical dude. I get to be a father, right? And then I have my 3 to 5 men that I really, really trust, where I get to show up and be safe as a son, right? And so staying in the chain link of that, especially within groups of men, again, I wrote my thesis on this, is so fucking fundamental, right? And so what that does for me is like, fuck the identity of the entrepreneur, the whatever. It's like, no, man, I'm a man amongst men. I'm a man amongst men, and I get to have these conversations with you and understand common cause, common motivation, right? And then I get to take it to a mentor of mine, and we're having the exact same conversation. And so what it does is it just levels everything, and I'm just right in the chain link. And that's it. I don't want anything else, bro. I just want to be a man amongst men.
I love that, dude. And like in certain ceremonies, in psychedelic ceremonies, that becomes so clear. like it's just a brotherhood. It's not what you do for work or how much money you make or any of that stuff. It's all fades away, and it's just being a man amongst the tribe, being a man amongst men. And you're making me think too, is like, I don't have any real mentors right now. I've been mentoring myself in some ways.
Self-initiating. So that, go ahead. Sorry, you want to finish that thought?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it is important for me to have mentors, because I am in a space holding role pretty often with transcendence and other things where I'm in a coaching role, but there is a lack of true connection with a mentor other than the words I read in a book from Lao Tzu, or the words I read from Jesus, or whoever it is, which are great. But I've had some pretty wild experiences where in meditation, I'm communicating with higher beings or angels or ascended masters, but to have a real world 3D mentor, other masculine man to talk to, that's been in my awareness. I was like, if I'm supposed to have a guru, universe, please show me who the guru is.
Yeah. And it's also such a forcing function to make sure that we're not creating too many stories out of the formlessness. Because you can go and have these experiences and you're like, I fucking saw the future. I know what's going to happen. I know who I am. I know what my role is. I know da 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 da. And you create these stories and these narratives. Really what you're plugged into are possibilities, right? I mean, that's, you look at physics too. But, and so, yeah. So like for me, because I'm somebody who loves the descent. I love the cave, right? But I have to have forcing functions in my life in the form of people that I really respect, that I can come to and say, hey, here was my experience. Here's what I think. Here's what I ended up. Whoa, okay. Let's talk about the experience. Let's not get into the meaning. Let's talk about the experience. Let's dig a little bit deeper before you continue on the story, right? And then we can talk about whether the story's real or not, or but like, let's just hold tight a little bit. Right? Because the temptation is to go and have these experiences and then create these narratives out of it and create our role in it or want to possess it. Right. You know? And so for me, it's a forcing function, big time. And the other thing that I find really interesting too, is that, so I use the term, like, you're a self-initiator, right? And I identify with that so deeply. Like, I was initiated through the books and the literature and but not fully, right? Because what I'm understanding too is that this energy of just like evolution of man, or just growing, right? Most men, they process their spiritual, emotional energy or this relational need with other men, which is very real, through sport and through business. Because that is our cultural context of mentors, apprenticeship, or whatever, right? And again, this is why I love sports. And so what I think is happening right now with this new earth and this new cultural context is that we are creating containers for folks like you and I to alchemize, process, understand this energy outside of the domain of just sport and business in a way that's way more holistic, way more inclusive of the bigger parts of ourselves.
Fascinating. I really appreciate your wisdom, man. Like, you give me a lot to think about.
Of course, man. Dude, I'm so happy. Man. I love you, dude.
Oh, man, I love you too. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
I'm excited for the day we get to meet in person.
100%. You're probably going to tower over me.
I heard one time you asked somebody how tall I was, but like they told me or something like that.
Oh, really? I don't remember that. You're 6'1", right?
6'1", 6'2"? No, I'm like 5'10".
Oh, I just figured like QB, you were like a big dog.
Nah.
Yeah.
How about you?
I'm like 5'9.5", bro. I'm not like
we're the same height.
Yeah.
I'm like 5'10", 177.
Yeah. I'm 5'9", 173 this morning.
Okay. Nice. I love it.
Yeah.
You have that and that's why I'd love to meet you in person, and like maybe we'll be in a ceremony together someday. I could definitely see that, but you have this warrior spirit for sure. Like, I can see it. Like, you're willing to go to the depths and be a leader, and I admire it a lot.
Yeah. Hanuman. I think of that. Well, I was at a men's retreat recently, Danny Miranda's men's retreat. And we were talking about leadership. We were talking about like paradigm shifters, like da, 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 da. And there was kind of this thing going around where it was kind of this like, deflection around like wanting to own the power or wanting to own your own power or own yourself as a leader or whatever. And there was kind of this moment where it just like fell out of me where it was like, well, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
Like somebody's got to do it. Like I'm looking around like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And I felt that too when I was in my cohort of my grad school, because I was in a small cohort. There was like 30 of us. And I was one of the only dudes in it. It was mostly women. One of the only kind of more masculine leaning dudes. And I had in so much of the conversation, you know, with our professors and stuff, it was very feminine, not in a bad way. I love the feminine. I love my feminine. And I remember like driving home someday and being like, man, like I wish like there was just more of that masculine edge or somebody brought that or whatever. And then I just like looked at it and I was like, oh shit, like that's me. Yeah. That's my role. I'm complaining about like my lack of accountability in that, like that actually is me. I need to fill that space and I need to own that.
Yeah. Answering the call. And I think that's the mark of a real leader is like somebody who almost doesn't want it. And you're like, I guess so. I guess it has to be me.
Totally.
That's so cool, dude.
Yeah.
I'm so excited to see what you create and build and the leader you evolve into way beyond the creator economy. Like that's just the first step. That's how we met each other, but it's going to play out much bigger.
I hope so. Yeah, man. I mean, for me, it's like, it's all about people, you know, and this was something that I had to get super, super clear on when I was in some more of like the ceremonial psychedelic spaces and stuff like that is like, I really had to accept and come to terms, and I'm still in process of it, my own desire for power or relationship to power, right? I mean, it feels good. And I'd found myself in power dynamics, whether I'm a therapist working with a client, right? There's very clear power dynamics, whatever. I have ethical training around this. But one of the things that came to me that really alleviated a lot of this suffering was my absolute certainty in knowing that I love people more than power.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. And with those things, like that's where true integrity comes in, because only you know. When you go to the depths in a meditation or in a psychedelic experience, nobody knows but you. Nobody knows if you're in a therapist relationship and like subtly like having, I don't know, some type of secret pleasure out of a power dynamic, but you know, and that's true integrity.
But
that's why guys like us, we have to go into the cave. We have to go to the depths to look like, okay, exactly. Show me, even if I don't want to see it, show me.
It's been such like a mantra for me is like, I'm not the type of dude that leaves stones unturned. And I've really had to accept that about myself because it's also gotten me in some trouble. And it's brought along some pain too. But a big part of that was with the power thing was actually in reaction to being in spiritual spaces, ceremonial spaces, where I started to see the dark shadow of it within some of the practitioners, the codependency, the spiritual narcissism, the manipulation, the power, all of that. It's very, very potent. It's very potent in those spaces. So,
yeah. And because you could see it, it becomes your responsibility to be the justice that counteracts it.
Yeah, dude. I love that you said that. I say this all the time when I'm working with someone and like, there's like a relational issue or whatever. And we talk about the high road, right? And I always say, I'm like, dude, you have to take the high road in this situation because you might be the only one that knows what it looks like.
Exactly. I mean, that goes so deep. I would even see that as like, that's the power of the Holy Spirit working through you. And it became apparent to me in my ceremonies in Peru. I became very aware of some power dynamics going on. And I was scared as fuck, dude. I thought I was going to die. But this goes really deep.
I'd love to hear a little more about it. I got to actually just plug in my computer real quick. You want to just hold tight for a second?
Yeah, I can share a little bit as you plug it in.
Yeah, please. I'm going to lose my mic though.
That's okay. I'll talk until you're back. So how much do I want to share? Right? It's like, how much do I really want to share about this? Okay, you're back. So I think I'm not going to go too deep. But what I will say is I became brutally aware of how the human ego plays in power dynamics, and how power dynamics are necessary to a certain extent to hold a container, but can be abused if the leader is not coming from integrity and wisdom and is not checked by other men, right? And now there was nothing necessarily negative that happened, but what I saw, because I have this ability to see, like I have this clairvoyance, and I saw the potentiality of what could go wrong, and it scared the fuck out of me. And what I realized is I told one person who I trusted in confidentiality, and she's like, no, I can't see that at all. Like blah, blah, blah. And I realized nobody else could see it but me. Now, does that mean I'm crazy and I'm just seeing things that aren't there? Or is it now my responsibility to step into more of a leadership role and know that, okay, these subtle things are underlying the entire experience. Other people can't see it. That's okay. It's not for them now, but I can see it. And now it's my responsibility. So it feels refreshing to talk about this with you, because I haven't talked about it with nearly anybody.
It's such a needed conversation in this domain, you know, and that ability to see, right? Like, I think like it's about seeing it and owning it, but like also wearing it as a loose garment too, right? Being willing to recognize that it may be off a little bit, may not be entirely the case, right? And I'll just speak from a direct experience with this, right? Because the projection mechanism of the psyche is really, really interesting. So there's a mentor of mine who's been a mentor for maybe 7-8 years. Brilliant dude in so many different capacities. And we had a big blow up on a retreat, and it was around this thing of power, right? It was his retreat. So he's very much the guy, kind of top dog, whatever. And I identified some things that were just a little distasteful for, I mean, at the time I called him a narcissist, but like, what really was actually happening was I wasn't in integrity with my own power and my own ability to lead, right? I was still in the shadow and dysfunction of my own leadership, that I was subtly trying to chop him down a little bit, right? To kind of bring, I don't know if it's like a top dog thing, whatever, but in these really subtle ways, I was kind of chopping him down a little bit. And then it ended up in this blow up, right? And so what happened was 6 to 8 months later, I found myself in more positions of power, right? I used to own a sober living. We had 13 guys that lived in there, yada, yada. And I found myself in these dynamics, and I found how tricky and difficult it is to hold in balance, right? And to be right-sized in relationship to power. And so the things that I saw that were present were present. What I said in some capacity was valid, but simultaneously there was this whole other side of the coin that had everything to do with me. And as soon as I washed through that and worked through that myself, we were able to come back together on a true egalitarian and both simultaneously be father and son for one another.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's an ultimate test of your brotherhood.
It is, dude. And we've gotten so much closer as a result of that.
I'm sure.
So much closer. Sure. Yeah.
Man, this has been so fun.
Yeah, dude.
I know you got a big birthday celebration going on later, so I want to be mindful of your time. But before we hop, for anybody who made it to the end, what can they expect from you? Where could they find more of you? What should they be looking out for? What are you excited about? Drop it all on us.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about my community that I'm working towards. It's a mental health, personal development community, you know, coming from the reference point of seeing, 20, 25 clients a week and burning out and dying, and working in a bunch of different treatment centers, owning a sober living, really seeing the shadow side of classic mental health treatment. I want to solve some of those problems, right? Create something that's not only better for the folks that I'm working with, but better for myself, because people have different needs, whether it's if text back. Not everyone needs an hour of therapy every week, right? There's so many different holistic opportunities for that. I do have some other stuff that I'm not quite ready to announce yet, that I'm kind of working on the specifics, but outside of that, I'm coming out of a season of kind of relaxation. Like, I worked really hard for a chunk of time, and then I took a couple months off and didn't really, apply any gas to the pedal a little bit. So I'm gearing up for the next big phase, which for me is YouTube. 100%. And really about my ideas, you know, like the creator thing's been great. It's great to get followers. It's great to make money. But for me, and this is, you know, Jung would say this too, when he would speak on why he wouldn't use substances. He said, well, for me, an idea is intoxicating enough.
Wow.
Right. And so I have some different ideas, right? There are a couple areas. I'm not an expert in psychology, but there's a couple areas where I do believe my knowledge is kind of at the modern knowledge of where, like, I have fresh takes and novel ideas and a really different perspective, especially for men and men's wellness. So I'm really geared up to focus on creating more cultural context for men to get deeper into this work.
Nice. I'm excited to see what you create, what you write, what you build. I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. Like, all these great psychologists, they didn't really start producing their life's work probably till their 60s, 70s, 80s. So got some time.
I got some time. I got
God
some
willing
that I'm chewing on, you know. Yeah, some bigger stuff. I do see myself moving back into bigger storytelling capacity, TV, film, more on kind of the production side of things. And I've got some really great relationships, and I'm still kind of in the fold of that business a little bit. So that's big picture stuff. And then, like I was saying before, it's about like land for me, regenerative farming. Like, I want to own some land. I want to have a place where all my people from all over the world can come and just feel good and just feel held and just walk away from time spent just feeling nourished. That's it. You know, that's really my main orientation.
I love it. I'm so excited. We're so aligned.
100%, dude. Yeah.
Cool, dude. Well, thank you so much. This was so fun. And I'll drop all your links and stuff below.
You got it, brother. Sounds good.